Live from the 22 News Broadcast Center, your local election headquarters. This is a 1st Massachusetts Congressional District Democratic primary debate. And now, here's Rich Teddemer.
Good evening and welcome to a special presentation of your election headquarters, a debate between the Democratic candidates running in the Massachusetts 1st Congressional District. We are joined tonight by the incumbent Congressman Richard Neal and the challenger Alex Morse, who is the mayor of Holyoke. The September 1st Democratic primary will likely determine who represents this district for the next 2 years. As of right now, there are currently no Republican candidates on the ballot. The Massachusetts 1st Congressional District is geographically the largest district in the state and includes all of Berkshire County, nearly all of Hampden County, western portions of Franklin County, western and southern portions of Hampshire County, and the southwestern portion of Worcester County. It includes larger cities like Springfield, Chicopee, Pittsfield, Westfield, and Holyoke, as well as several suburban communities and many rural small towns. Now let's learn a little more about the candidates. Richard Neal was first elected to Congress back in 1988. He currently serves as the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. Prior to his election to Congress, he was the mayor of Springfield from 1983 to 1989 and was a Springfield city councilor before that. Alex Morse was first elected mayor of Holyoke in 2011 at the age of 22. He is the youngest person ever to have been elected mayor of the city. He has won re-election 3 times and is now in his 4th term in office. We have a lot of important issues to get to tonight, so we want to move right to the questions. This debate will be a question and answer format. I will ask a question to be answered by both candidates. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to respond. After each response, each candidate will have 1 minute for rebuttal. Prior to the beginning of the debate, we held a drawing to determine who will be the first to answer the first question, and Congressman Neal, you will go first. And that first question has to deal with a story that's been very big here in Western Massachusetts for the last 2 weeks, and it's also received a lot of national attention. In a letter, the College Democrats of Massachusetts accused Mayor Morse of inappropriate behavior with college students, allegations that Mayor Morse has said were politically motivated. What is your response to the allegations themselves, as well as to the ongoing questions about the origins of those accusations? Congressman Neal.
Let me reiterate, as I have time and again, that there can be no room for homophobia, misogyny, or racism in America and or in a congressional campaign. These students stepped forward independently of me. I don't even know their names. These students should be heard. There is an investigator that has been hired. A review process is underway, and we should await what the reviewer says. I think that's the way to proceed. But the idea that I or my campaign would have been involved in this doesn't stand up under the magnifying glass of critical analysis, given the following fact. It's inconsistent with my character and my career to have embraced any sort of tactics that would have talked about this sort of behavior. These students stepped forward. I read about it, as everybody else did, on a Friday night. The students then pointed out in a subsequent press release that what they did was independent of my campaign and my organization. Here's the point. We had nothing to do with this. The students should be heard. There's a process in place.
Mayor Morse, you have 90 seconds.
Great. Thank you for that question, and thank you, Rich. Thank you, Congressman, for being here, and most importantly, thank you at home for tuning into this important process. And I think I will trust all of you at home to come to your own conclusions. It was incredibly suspicious that less than 3 weeks before the most competitive primary that this congressman has ever seen throughout his career, and I will let you come to your own conclusions. We now have evidence to suggest that the students involved wanted to curry favor with one of the most powerful incumbents in Washington, and it was an attorney that worked for the Massachusetts Democratic Party, not the students, that actually wrote this letter to me in the first place. And this is exactly what people don't like about politics, that I, Alex Morse, have been put in a position to talk about my personal life rather than talk about the policies and legislation that will improve your lives at home. And so again, I will trust all of you at home to come to your own conclusions, but it is incredibly suspicious that this happened again less than 3 weeks before this election. And it's why I ran for office 9 years ago as a 21-year-old against a powerful Democratic incumbent in the city of Holyoke because people were tired of the same backroom deals and political ploys that tear people down rather than build people up. I want to talk about health care. I want to talk about economic and racial justice, combating the climate crisis, getting money out of politics, and oftentimes power will stop at nothing to hold on to power. And that's exactly what we're seeing here in this race. And so I'm excited in the final 12 days to bring our message directly to you in your living rooms, on your doorsteps, and over the phone to talk about the type of leadership and representation that all of you deserve.
Congressman Neal, you have 60 seconds rebuttal.
I'm pleased to respond again. There is no room for homophobia. There is no room for racism or misogyny. My campaign was not connected to these allegations. These students stepped forward. We read about it, as everybody else did. The students subsequently issued another statement that indicated that I had nothing to do with this. And I think that that's the matter that stands before us. There's an investigator in place. The students should be heard. The review process is underway. The suggestion, again, that there was any untoward behavior by my campaign as it relates to this matter is an effort to confuse the electorate.
Mayor Morse, 60 seconds rebuttal.
Yeah, no, I think, again, the voters at home will see this for what it is. And I want to thank all of you for the outpouring of support over the last 2 weeks. It's invigorated me and our campaign and our supporters and the people in every corner of the 1st District. And this is ironic coming from a member of Congress that for the last 30 years has prided himself on never running a negative TV ad, on never sending a negative mailer. And I'm sure many of you at home have seen plenty of mailers paid for by the committee to elect Richard E. Neal, with my face on them, even pictures of myself from my personal Facebook, and they're decent pictures. But this is, again, this congressman is in the political fight of his life. And I'm not fighting for a political career, I'm fighting for the people of this district. And so again, I will trust you to come to your own conclusions. But again, I want to get back to the issues and talk about the type of representation that we deserve. And as I said, over the last couple of weeks, this goes to the height of the Massachusetts Democratic Party. This isn't Republican, Democrat. It's about having an unbought member of Congress. The chair of the Massachusetts Democratic Party took me to lunch over a year ago and discouraged me from running against this congressman. And so I will stop at nothing to go up against power to fight for people here in Western Mass.
That is time, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much. Question number 2. The COVID-19 pandemic has dominated the news for the past year and changed the way we live our lives. The CARES Act was crafted to prevent the COVID-19 pandemic from doing further damage to our economy. Congressman Neal helped to write it and says it has helped save many jobs, while Mayor Morse says that the act didn't go far enough to help working Americans. Why are you right and your opponent is wrong when it comes to this legislation?
This is about bailing out people, not bailing out corporations. We have a member of Congress that proudly proclaimed that the first call he made was to a former CEO of Goldman Sachs, Bob Rubin, to craft the CARES Act. When I'm in Congress, the first call that I will make is to all of you at home, the people here in the 1st Congressional District. The fact that Congressman Neal and folks in leadership, Democrat and Republican, think a one-time payment of $1,200 is enough to the most vulnerable residents of our community. I have been in the trenches these last several months with folks in our community who were going hungry. It was the local government, not the federal government, that's providing months of free internet to families that don't have internet at home. We've given out tens of thousands of meals to folks that would otherwise go hungry. What an indictment on this country, that when we have to close schools, we have to wonder, how are our young people and children and families going to eat? How are they going to stay connected? But most importantly right now, a one-time payment of $1,200 isn't going to cut it. While Congressman Neal writes a legislation with Donald Trump that creates a $500 million slush fund for corporations. This is why it's important. We have a member of Congress that isn't taking a single dime from corporations and corporate political action committees, so that when we are in Congress, we're fighting for everyday people.
Congressman Neal, you have 90 seconds.
Thanks, Rich. The most irresponsible statement during the course of this campaign comes from Mayor Morse, when he said he would have voted against the CARES Act. 5 members of the House of Representatives voted against the CARES Act. 10,400 small businesses in the 1st Congressional District received paycheck protection loans. The most important thing we did was to extend unemployment insurance. How about the $400 million that went to area hospitals? And that check that he referenced, that was $2,400 for joint filers under $150,000. When the mayor says he would have voted against the CARES Act, Commonwealth Magazine indicated 2 days ago that 1.1 million jobs in Massachusetts were saved because of the CARES Act. The CARES Act provided money to the city of Holyoke to undertake some of the items and things that he's just talked about. But the CARES Act was the most significant piece of domestic legislation that brought about an opportunity to take us from stability and relief to recovery. I'm stunned that he would have voted against unemployment insurance for 31 million Americans. He would have voted against a plan that saved many businesses in his own community of Holyoke, Massachusetts. His position on this is irresponsible. He would have been one of 5 in the House of Representatives to vote against the CARES Act.
Mayor Morse, 60 seconds for rebuttal.
Yeah, this is a key difference between the congressman and myself, is that I will be fighting for everyday people. And again, the CARES Act bailed out corporations, and while I, here in the city of Holyoke and across the district, when families are going hungry, when families are at risk of losing their homes and their apartments, when 50% of minority-owned businesses in this district and in this country are shuttering, yet we again create a $500 billion slush fund for corporations, that is irresponsible. And this is the problem with Congressman Neal, not understanding the urgency of the moment. The CARES Act wasn't big enough. It didn't go big enough for the working people of this country. And again, if it was so great, why do we need to rush back to Washington, D.C. to write more legislation? We need legislation and member of Congress that actually meet the moment that we're in as a country, that focus less on corporations and institutions and focus on families right here in Western and Central Massachusetts. And so, Congressman, we need a House of Representatives that doesn't compromise their values the minute you walk in the negotiating room, that will always look out for the working people of Western and Central Mass.
Congressman Neal, 60 seconds rebuttal.
Thanks, Rich. Actually, we're rushing back to Washington to save the Postal Service. The CARES Act, supported by Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey and every member of the congressional delegation from Massachusetts, saved millions of jobs, provided 31 million Americans with health insurance. Our hospitals were funded, including extra money for Holyoke Medical Center, the biggest employer in the city of Holyoke. The mayor is saying that of the options in front of him, he would have rejected the one that helped to save the American economy. Commonwealth Magazine said more than 1 million jobs in the state of Massachusetts. And by the way, when he mentions these big loans for corporations, the average loan in the 1st Congressional District was under $150,000. That's what's important to remember. His position on the CARES Act is totally irresponsible.
Question number 3, gentlemen, and it goes to Congressman Neal first. Communities of color have been particularly impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, both nationally and locally. It has also further exposed long-lasting inequality in health care. As the representative for the 1st Congressional District, what would you do over the next 2 years to confront this racial disparity and improve health care outcomes for communities of color?
I think the issue of racial disparity is in front of us to be addressed, and I've been consistent on these issues over the course of my career. I brought the first affirmative action plan to Springfield City Hall when I was mayor. I embraced set-asides. I was one of those individuals back in the mid-'80s who sold the city's stocks in South Africa. We just conducted extensive hearings for the first time in the Ways and Means Committee once we became the majority as Democrats to address the issue of racial disparity and to address the great issue of the stain on our history, race. I will take the letter that John Lewis authored just before he passed about my character and about my emphasis on addressing racial and income disparities because they're linked. That's the real issue that's in front of us on this matter. The mayor, however, would have opposed the CARES Act, which again was the first line of opportunity for these families to receive health care based upon the $400 million that was sent to the 1st Congressional District of Massachusetts. That's the real issue. The substance of that proposal addressed those very issues of racial and income inequality by making sure that everybody had access to those hospitals.
Mayor Morse, you have 90 seconds.
Yeah, this is an incredibly important question. And Congressman Neal, again, has been in office and in power for 32 years. And we today have some of the worst racial and economic disparities of our lifetime. And people are literally dying in our streets, dying from racism, dying from COVID-19. And so the pandemic and virus of racism is alive and well in this country. And we have never fully reckoned with our history of slavery and the modern manifestations of slavery and racism in this country. When you look at outcomes in this district, the fact that in Springfield, Massachusetts, majority-minority community is still the asthma capital of our entire country. When you look at the public housing stock in this community, where people of color and low-income folks have been relegated to live, the air that they breathe, the water that they drink. I mean, I do not know, Congressman, how you could be proud of outcomes in this district. That African-American women in this district and in the city of Springfield have a life expectancy 20 years less than their white counterparts just a few blocks up. I want to make sure that I go to Washington to fight for everybody. And when in the middle of a pandemic, we have minority-owned businesses closing. We have healthcare institutions closing. I mean, in Holyoke today, I was at a standout with nurses. We have a birthing center closing in our community. We have hundreds of inpatient psychiatric beds closing in our community. In northern Berkshire County and North Adams, they're still reeling from the closure of their only inpatient hospital there. And so racism is embedded in every single policy in our country, and it's the biggest threat to our success as a nation today. And we need to be incredibly intentional about dismantling systems of oppression and standing up for the most vulnerable people in our community.
Congressman Neal, you have 60 seconds rebuttal.
The mayor offered a very inconsistent view of what he just mentioned. He indicated that it was his opinion that people were dying, but he would not have voted for the CARES Act. He indicated that this issue disproportionately affected minorities, which it did, but that he would have voted against the CARES Act. Now, the most essential workers, by the way, who depend, and we depend upon every single day for public transportation, the PVTA, he didn't bother to show up for any of the meetings. He missed 60% of the meetings of the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority. So on one hand, he's heralding his advocacy on behalf of the most vulnerable amongst us, and then not showing up for the meetings that would have made it easier for them to make it back and forth to work, those people that we depend upon every single day. Those are the inconsistencies of the suggestions he's made as it relates to COVID. His vote, he said, would have been against the CARES Act, which would have harmed the very people he's telling us that he would have advocated for.
Mayor Morse, 60 seconds.
Yeah, let's get this very clear. When I'm in Congress, I will fight for legislation that meets the moment. And the CARES Act was inadequate. It did not meet the moment. It did not bail out the American people. We have a member of Congress that is on the record opposing a $2,000 a month stimulus payment to the American people. He opposed the Paycheck Guarantee Act. He even talked about the deficit and talks like a Republican when it comes to addressing the issues that are faced by all of you at home. And so even before COVID-19, even before this pandemic, our society, our government is broken. When I launched this campaign, we didn't expect a global pandemic to hit this country, hit our community, but it has only crystallized what's wrong with this country, who our federal government works for and who it doesn't. I mean, we saw billions of dollars bailing out Wall Street and Big Pharma, and we still have a member of Congress. Millions of Americans, thousands of people here in the district have lost their job and have therefore lost their employer-based health insurance. And we still don't have a member of Congress that believes that health care should be a fundamental human right, and instead is talking about subsidizing COBRA benefits in the private health care industry. He wants to talk about PVTA meetings and school committee meetings rather than talking about who he's fighting for, and he's not fighting for us.
You get the next question. The killing of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis touched off worldwide protests and renewed calls to dismantle the structural racism in our country. Some of those protests have been right here in Western Massachusetts. What lessons have you learned from these protests about the state of racial injustice in our area? And as a member of Congress, what reforms will you support and propose to bring about a more just society? Mayor Morse.
And thank you for asking that question. And as I said before, people are dying in this country for no other reason than being black and brown and leaving their house. And as a white person, I don't have to fear the police like people of color do in this country. And so we need to have a reckoning, which we are, and I welcome it as a mayor, as a person in this country, to use my white privilege to advance the causes of everybody in this country. And so when I look at my record over the last 9 years as a mayor, working hand in hand with my police department, making sure that we are deliberate about demilitarizing our department, not using federal funds to militarize our department, making sure that over 50% of the police officers that I have personally hired over the last 9 years are Latino and African American, look like and reflect and speak the language of the vast majority of our population. Over 90% of our officers are trained in implicit bias and de-escalation, and that's why not a single officer in our city in 9 years has had to fire a single shot. And over the last 9 years, I've stood up for immigrant and racial justice. We became one of the first sanctuary cities in the entire country in 2014 and barred our department from complying with ICE. In 2016, I was the first and the only mayor to support the legalization of marijuana, to dismantle the dangerous impact of the war on drugs on communities of color, and to allow folks to build wealth in this emerging industry. And so as mayor, we have made progress, but we need a partner in the federal government that would repeal qualified immunity, repeal cash bail, pursue legislation to provide reparations to the descendants of slaves in this country, sign on to Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley's BREATHE Act, and really be a fighter for racial and social justice.
Congressman Neal, you have 90 seconds.
George Floyd's murder was a jarring example of the racial disparities that exist in America. We all were horrified by what we witnessed. In the House of Representatives, we passed the most progressive piece of legislation to address those very issues, including the issue of qualified immunity. But just as importantly, we put aside money, as Joe Biden has indicated, that he would use to reward those police departments across the country that would in fact take up the structural reforms that would be necessary to alleviate these tensions that exist when police men and women are called to the scene of a crime or an alleged crime. What's important about that is the following. Spending more money to ease some of those tensions, hiring more social workers makes a good deal of sense. That happens frequently because the situation escalates, the result of which is a bad outcome for the families that are involved. And it is our responsibility at the federal level, but overwhelmingly what the mayor didn't mention, and by the way, when he mentioned all the work that he's done on refugee resettlement, he took 6 refugees last year in the city of Holyoke. But what's important about this to remember is that in this instance here, de-escalating the confrontation is paramount. That legislation that we passed in the House of Representatives, which I got up and spoke in support of, and now sits on Mitch McConnell's desk, would go a long way toward helping to alleviate many of these tensions that we witness every day between the police and minorities in America.
Mayor Morse, you have 60 seconds rebuttal.
Yeah, I mean, we have to reimagine policing in this country. And when we think about the challenges in our country, the unfortunate reality that as a country, we criminalize poverty, we criminalize addiction, we criminalize mental illness in this country. I mean, we have the highest rate of incarceration of any developed nation on earth. And we need to address that head on and have a conversation about racial disparities and policing. It's related to healthcare and transportation and making sure that people in this community have opportunities. And this is a member of Congress whose biggest supporter is the mayor of Springfield, a mayor that sought to close a church that was providing sanctuary to an undocumented immigrant. I mean, I, as a mayor under Donald Trump's new executive order, have to consent for the resettlement of refugees in our community. And Mayor Sarno proudly proclaimed that he refused to sign that letter in 2020. And when Congressman Neal was asked, do you agree with Mayor Sarno's refusal to accept refugees in his community? He couldn't answer. I mean, in 2020, if you don't have the moral fortitude and integrity to take on racial injustice, to speak up for the most vulnerable people in your community, to be silent. I mean, we need a member of Congress that can unequivocally say that Black Lives Matter. It's not about being performative. It's about showing it every single day in your legislation.
Congressman Neal, 60
The
seconds.
problem with the argument he made just now is he wants you to think that he took these progressive postures in the city of Holyoke. As I noted, he resettled 6 refugees. I supported the refugee resettlement of the horrific outcome of what happened with the Syrian crisis. I have worked with many of these agencies over a long period of time to bring about settlements in these communities. He's inconsistent when he says, I've done this and I've done that, when he accepted 6 refugees. He's trying to make this out to be something that he disputes with the mayor of Springfield. He ought to have that conversation with the mayor of Springfield. My argument is that I have consistently supported these refugee resettlement programs and have been very firm in what I did not long ago on behalf of the Syrian resettlements.
Next question, gentlemen. Part of being a member of Congress is providing services to your constituents, hearing their concerns, and securing funding for local institutions. Why do you believe you'll do a better job than your opponent at providing those services and assistance to the people of the 1st Congressional District? And Congressman Neal, you have 90 seconds.
First of all, I've delivered. Whether it's in Pittsfield with the Colonial Theater and New Markets tax credits, whether or not it's the 8 largest projects in the city of Holyoke, the library, the data center, the emergency room at Holyoke Medical Center, at the health center, $5 million of improvements. By the way, the mayor said he would have voted against all of those initiatives. How about Union Station, North-South Rail, my work already in East-West Rail. In Southbridge, Massachusetts, the Defense Accounting Conference Center comes to mind. I wrote much of the CARES Act, which helped to save the city of Holyoke and the city of Springfield and the 1st Congressional District. Unemployment insurance, I've delivered. Health care support through our hospitals, I've delivered. Those paychecks, those stimulus checks, I've delivered. The mayor said he would have voted against all of that. I've delivered time and again. And in the city of Holyoke, one of the biggest problems we've had is the mayor doesn't show up. He missed 28 of 62 meetings of the Holyoke School Committee, why the Holyoke schools fell into receivership. And for the audience that's watching tonight, what that means is the following. As chairman of the Holyoke School Committee, the schools were taken away from Mayor Morse. On the school building committee, I've tried to congratulate him for consistency. PBTA, schools, school building committee, 23 meetings, he missed all 23.
Mayor Morse, you have 90 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, this is getting quite comical because instead of talking about his record or lack thereof here in the 1st Congressional District, he gets asked about healthcare, talks about school committee meetings, talks about climate change, and he talks about school committee meetings. And so, I mean, the fact is, I show up time and time again. I've showed up every day over the last 9 years, and that's why I'm proud of my record. And we have a member of Congress, again, that is bought and paid for by corporate interests. He is literally the #1 recipient of corporate money in the entire House of Representatives, more than every Democrat and even more than every Republican. And I have modeled this campaign as to how I want to represent you in Washington, showing up in every corner of this district, not just here in Hampden County, but in northern Berkshire County, in Worcester County, in Franklin County, in southern Berkshire County, and actually doing town halls. Congressman Neal talks a lot about writing legislation. I mean, how can you write legislation that's responsive to the people here if in over 3 years you haven't even had a single town hall? This isn't about showing up in the district for a photo op, talking to corporate CEOs and executives. It's about demonstrating results. And you talk about these projects, and I thank you for writing legislation on tax credits, but the days of earmarks and pork are over. There are standard grant programs in Congress that will not go away when I'm elected on September 1st. And so whether it's funding for public education, for schools, I mean, let's talk about schools for a second. When I took office, only 49% of our students were graduating from high school. And now nearly 75% of our students are graduating from high school. I mean, today I was endorsed by our former superintendent receiver, who took over our schools in 2015 through 2020. Not once had a conversation with Congressman Neal about the issues that we have struggled with. No partnership, no leadership from our federal government.
Congressman Neal, you have 60
So you
seconds
notice you really
rebuttal.
didn't answer the question that we asked. I've stood up for 5,230 children in the Holyoke Public Schools, and the reason those scores went up, it's because of the receiver, not because of Mayor Morse. He was absent for those meetings that were critical. He tried to pass that off by saying, well, the chairmanship of the Holyoke School Committee, it's but a ceremonial position. No, it's not. You run the meetings. You're the chief advocate. What is more progressive in our lives than standing up for children in our public school system? Giving them a chance, giving them the opportunity. I'm a product of Springfield's public schools. I represent those values every single day. I made it to visit every classroom in Springfield's public schools over a 2-year period. Not every school, every classroom at every school. And that's why I'm proud of the fact tonight that I have the support of the teachers union as well as members of the school committee in the city of Holyoke.
Mayor Morse, you have 60 seconds rebuttal.
Yeah, again, I think it's ironic that Congressman Neal wants to have a conversation about accessibility and showing up. When we were fighting for local control in 2015, Congressman Neal was nowhere to be found. And we've made these improvements without a partnership, without a partner from Congressman Neal and our federal government. I mean, listen to this. Over 60% of our federal discretionary budget goes to war and defense, to building bombs and weapons, not to education, not to health care. I mean, you would never know we have one of the most powerful members of Congress, or I should say one of the most powerful seats, because Congressman Neal takes weak positions. He opposes the Green New Deal. He opposes Medicare for all. He opposes a wealth tax. I mean, we haven't had new schools constructed in the city of Holyoke in over 30 years, from decades of divestment from public education, from domestic priorities that would actually make a difference in our lives. And so Congressman Neal can keep talking about school committee meetings, which number one, he's wrong. Number two, I show up. And when Congressman Neal actually shows up, he's showing up to vote against health care for you. He's showing up to vote against the $2,000 a month payment for you and your family in a time of crisis. I mean, we need real leadership that shows up time and time again.
The next question, gentlemen, Mayor Morse, you'll go first. The Holyoke Soldiers' Home was the site of the nation's deadliest COVID-19 outbreak in a long-term facility. 76 veteran residents died after testing positive for COVID-19. While the Soldiers' Home is a state-run facility, not a federal one, is there anything you can do as a member of Congress to ensure our veterans receive the care that they need and to make sure that something like this doesn't ever happen again? Mayor Morse, 90 seconds.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, Rich. And this is certainly close to home, given that this happened in the city of Holyoke. And I know Congressman Neal and I share the same outrage as to what happened here. And I know the congressman had a family member at the home. And our veterans certainly deserve better. And we send our veterans off to war. When they come back, we need to make sure that they have housing and health care and dignity. And too often, our federal government has fallen short. I'm incredibly proud of what we've done on the local level to welcome our veterans back home, to provide those services at the local level. We have one of the best veteran service organizations at the War Memorial on Appleton Street in Holyoke. And I remember when this happened, we opened up our Emergency Operations Center at City Hall, making sure that, number one, we can mitigate this crisis, we can protect the most vulnerable among us, and also look ahead towards what a just recovery will look like for our community. And I blew the whistle that Sunday afternoon. I was hearing from employees and nurses and loved ones of veterans that were falling ill, that said our leadership is inadequate, isn't taking this pandemic seriously. And so I reached out directly to the Baker administration, directly to Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito. And within 12 hours, we had a response team and the National Guard on Monday morning at the Soldiers' Home, doing everything they could to stop the spread of that virus, working with the Holyoke Medical Center to open up new units to make sure that we protect those that tested negative at the Soldiers' Home. And I remember I saw Congressman Neal weeks after announcing that he would do anything he can from the federal government to bring resources to bear. And Congressman, it's 30 years too late. Veterans have passed away because we have a healthcare system that values profits over people, and our veterans deserve better.
Congressman Neal, you have 90 seconds.
One of the trustees at the Holyoke Soldiers' Home said, as the mayor was seeking headlines, said, "We've never seen him here." I'm at the Holyoke Soldiers' Home all the time, not just to visit an uncle, but to visit many of the residents that have been there. I moved immediately on this. Holyoke Medical Center, they needed money. I intervened with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary Azar. I personally requested from him money to come to the aid of Holyoke Medical Center because of the fact that they had been so good in taking those veterans into their care. I have a strong record of veterans advocacy, but also not just in the general, but in the specific as well. The mayor mentioned that he called attention to the problem, but he had never been there. Now, let me just give you another interesting part of the mayor's argument over whether or not he's available. There are calls that take place and did take place weekly with officials from the state, and it is a state facility. The mayor either didn't participate in the calls or he dropped off early from the calls. That's not been my position. I've been there. I've met with those families. I've met with Paul Barabani. I've talked to those families. I've met with the administration. I've talked to Governor Baker extensively as they just chose a new development team to rebuild the Soldiers' Home, and there's more coming, I can assure you of that.
Mayor Morse, you have 60 seconds for rebuttal.
Yeah, I mean, this is just completely disingenuous. And, you know, I don't want to have to call the congressman a liar, but I will. Wow. Because I have been at the Soldiers' Home. While he was in Washington, spending a high life with lobbyists and corporate donors, I was hearing directly from all of you, from family members, from nurses, from loved ones. I mean, nurses that were literally in tears, that didn't have the proper PPE to go into work. I mean, this is why the Massachusetts Nurses Association has endorsed this campaign, the largest nurses union in the entire state. And while hospital executives and CEOs are spending millions of dollars on ads in this district and sending you mailers, the nurses, the actual people that are on the front lines, we're represented by the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, and nurses that are risking their lives and their families' lives understand the need for Medicare for all, understand the need to have PPE in the middle of a pandemic. And so while you were in Washington, Congressman, I was with these families on those calls, visiting places in Holyoke. He wants you to think I'm some absent mayor. I am the most accessible mayor that this city has ever seen, on social media, over email, in person, in the city.
Time, Mayor.
And we have an absent member of Congress that refuses to look you in the eye.
Congressman Neal, you have 60
You
seconds.
could use social media to make people think you're in the city. I mean, that's what's disingenuous here. I'm saying that I have met with these families repeatedly. I'm working on a new design plan, even though it's not a federal responsibility, with Governor Baker and Paul Barabani and those family members who've poured their hearts out to me as I've talked to them about what went awry at the Soldiers' Home. And virtually every organized labor group in America, including the AFL-CIO, the Teamsters Union, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, the firefighters in Holyoke, the Teachers Union in Holyoke, they all support my candidacy. So I understand the argument that is prevalent. It's never my fault. It's never my responsibility. And I want to say this to you, Mr. Mayor. I would not stoop to calling you a liar.
Congressman Neal, you get the next question. The opioid crisis has impacted so many lives here in Western Massachusetts. Have federal government efforts to reduce overdose deaths and improve treatment really helped? And what legislative changes can be made to help those dealing with addiction? Congressman Neal, you have 90 seconds.
Thanks, Rich. I wrote large portions of the Affordable Care Act, which went a long way toward addressing many of these issues as it relates to opiate addiction. Every one of us tonight that's watching has a family member, a friend, a neighbor, or we know somebody who has the addiction. In 2015, in Holyoke, with Mayor Morse, Ed Markey and I were amongst the 2 members of Congress to call attention to what was happening with the opiate crisis. There aren't many members of Congress that can say they expanded an entitlement program. I did. Medicare now reimburses those with over 65 with opiate addiction. I have pushed repeatedly for more money at the ground level to address this problem. Again, what this does to families, because we all know those families that have this problem. We all understand what this is doing. So when I was at Holyoke Health Center last week doing a tour where Mayor Morse said he would have voted against the $5 million in improvements that's going to go a long way toward addressing opiate addiction, or at Holyoke Medical Center where they have a unit that tries to take care of those individuals, he would have opposed it. So it's long on rhetoric, it's empty on action.
Mayor Morse, you have 90 seconds.
Yeah, this is something, as many of you at home know, is incredibly personal to me. I lost my brother to a heroin overdose this past February after struggling his entire adult life to overcome addiction. And as mayor, it's been one of my passions. When I took office in 2012, we had the highest rate of HIV and hepatitis C via IV drug use. And that's why I opened up a needle exchange program in the city of Holyoke to help those folks most in need. It was only the 5th program in the state and the first one since 1995. I got sued by my own city council for implementing one of the most effective harm reduction programs that actually makes a difference in people's lives. And because of that lawsuit, it led to the opening of dozens more programs across the state, including in Berkshire County. We went from 5 to 30 programs. Federally, needle exchange programs are still illegal. Congressman Neal has done nothing about it. I support safe injection facilities. They are still illegal federally. Congressman Neal has done nothing about it. And let's look at data and outcomes, because Congressman Neal keeps talking about legislation and his power in the chairmanship of the Ways and Means. Overdose death rates are going down across the state, but guess where they're going up? Here in Hampden County, in Berkshire County, only in Western Massachusetts. And you can say you care about the opioid epidemic, but you can't take on these opioid manufacturers that intentionally fuel this crisis when you're taking tens of thousands of dollars from those very companies that made it a very intentional decision to fuel this crisis in the first place.
Congressman Neal, 60 seconds for a rebuttal.
That's nonsense, what he just said about taking money from those entities. The most important expansion of drug treatment in America was the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. That has done more to alleviate the stresses that come with treating patients than any other single entity. It's more than any city has done. It's more than any state has done. The Affordable Care Act has expanded addiction services everywhere, whether it's the Holyoke Health Center or the Springfield Health Center, or in Berkshire County, where I have visited with those families and visited those health centers as they've attempted to deal with the menacing nature of opiate addiction. But for 65-year-olds and over, Medicare now reimburses those folks for treatment because of my work expanding an entitlement program.
Mayor Morse, you have 60 seconds.
Again, Congressman Neal just doesn't understand the urgency of the moment. I mean, people are literally dying in our streets, including my own brother. And I remember just over a year ago, and those families impacted by this disease at home know this experience all too well. We couldn't even find my brother a detox bed in Holyoke or in Springfield. We put him on a bus and he went to Pittsfield to the McGee unit. And the people of Pittsfield opened up their arms and their community. He went to detox, did a step-down program. And the number of barriers that we put up as a society to folks that want to get their lives back. I mean, $600 a week to go to a halfway house. Folks are expected to get a job, yet they have a record. I mean, we have made progress in Holyoke on this epidemic without any help or assistance from Congressman Neal. And again, he has taken tens of thousands of dollars from the very opioid manufacturers that literally fueled this crisis in the first place. And so this is personal to me, and I know it's personal to you. And as a mayor, we've been taking on and actually suing these companies to benefit the harm reduction programs that we've been implementing in our community.
Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and numerous other members of Congress have been advocating for a Green New Deal, which, among other things, calls for a complete shift to renewable energy, eliminating greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, and growing clean manufacturing in the United States. Please explain your position on this high-profile legislation. Mayor Morse, you have 90 seconds.
So let me just start with the fact that we are represented by a member of Congress. He's the only member of the Massachusetts delegation that refuses to support the Green New Deal. We have 9 members of Congress in Massachusetts. He's the only one of the 9 that refuses to sign on. The Green New Deal can be transformative for Western and Central Massachusetts. It will create thousands of good-paying union jobs. We have more farms here in the 1st Congressional District than any other district in the state. They're being impacted by changing weather patterns, changing precipitation. I mean, I remember as mayor, when I showed up, time and time again, as always. In the fall of 2017, after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, we welcomed thousands of Puerto Rican migrants to our community. In the small towns, in our infrastructure, we are not prepared for the inland migration from coastal communities, more climate-related disasters globally. And we have a member of Congress that continues to take money from the fossil fuel industry, from big oil and big gas. And so again, you can't take on the opioid manufacturers if you're taking their money. You can't take on the big pharmaceutical companies if you're taking their money. And you're not going to understand the existential threat of climate change when you're taking money from fossil fuel companies at the same time. I have taken the no fossil fuel money pledge because when I go to Washington, I want you to know that you can trust me, to look out for you, to look out for the issues that are facing the people here in the district. And on climate, Congressman Neal is stuck in the 80s. We have arrived at the point where the science and the data is clear, and we need members of Congress that are willing to meet the moment.
Congressman Neal, you have 90 seconds.
The data is clear. It's the great existential threat of our time. So the proposal is a worthwhile goal, and I'm a supporter. But it's legislation that changes our lives. So what did I do recently? I offered the most assertive use of tax policy in American history to take us on a path to renewable energy. First, tax credits for and tax incentives for wind, solar, battery power storage, electric vehicles, and a credit for a used electric vehicle, but also an upgrade of the national grid. Now here's the fallacy of the argument that the mayor just offered. So there are those of us who have been at this for a considerable period of time that have outstanding records as it relates to environmental concerns. I have, for all my years in Congress, opposed drilling in the Anwar, the Arctic refuge. I've always opposed drilling on offshore bases for gas and oil. In addition, I supported Ed Markey's decarbonization plan when he proposed it in the House of Representatives. I'm in favor of returning to the Paris Climate Accord. But you know what? The difference between the mayor and I on this, over these years, I have an approval rating from the League of Conservation Voters of 97%, and the biggest recycling facility in America is the one that I built on Bernie Avenue. 103 communities participated. I was doing this before the mayor started to talk about it.
Time. Mayor Morse, you have 60 seconds for rebuttal.
Again, climate change is the existential threat of our time. It's our biggest foreign policy threat, our biggest domestic threat. And Congressman Neal has been in Washington for 30 years, and here he goes again, talking about a tax credit here, a tax credit there, a small grant here, and a small grant there. We need a Green New Deal for Western and Central Massachusetts. Young people are marching in our streets, demanding a Green New Deal. They went to your office in Springfield, and as usual, the congressman and his staff refused to come out, refused to have a conversation about the importance of a Green New Deal. This would literally create thousands of good-paying jobs here in our district. Congressman Neal is one of those members of Congress that talks about what we can't do, what we can't afford. But we need a member of Congress that understands that you don't get what you don't fight for. And a Green New Deal is a no-brainer. The fact that every other member of Congress in this state has embraced it, and Congressman Neal refuses to do so. And over the last 9 years, we've transitioned the city to 92% carbon neutral without any help from this member of Congress and our federal government.
Congressman Neal, you have 60 seconds rebuttal.
So here's the problem with the deception that the mayor just offered. I was in Washington the day that they came to visit. They met with my staff. For him to say that nobody came out or that they were turned away, that is simply not true. I was in Washington that day, and the records will reflect that. And you know that, Mr. Mayor. In addition, a consistent voting record on environmental issues, but most importantly, the sound argument that it's legislation that changes our lives. So in the Moving Forward Act, we have the Green Act. And I would challenge the mayor to dispute anything in the Green Act that he disagrees with. And when he says things that are dismissive, for example, like, oh, a tax credit here or a tax credit there, how about my efforts to expand the earned income tax credit? To expand credits for women so that they can take advantage of child care at a very perilous time. For him to say that I was in that office when they came in that day, he's misleading you, Rich.
Congressman Neal, you get the next question first. The Western Massachusetts economy has not seen the same growth that the economy in the eastern part of the state has seen over the past few decades. We are now facing the additional challenge of a major recession caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. In Congress, what do you plan to do over the next 2 years to bring about economic development and job growth in our area? And Congressman Neal, you have 90 seconds.
I think there's a series of issues that confront the western part of the state because part of it's more rural nature, even though there are certainly urban areas. But I think one of the game changers for us in western and central Massachusetts would be a significant investment in east-west rail. Taking the trains from Boston to Worcester to Springfield and on to Pittsfield, which I raised yesterday with a group of business leaders that were visiting Springfield for the purpose of talking about the Western Mass economy with, by the way, the president of Holyoke Community College, who I think does a terrific job. And we've talked about the various issues that confront us. Part of it is we have one research university, a great one, at the University of Massachusetts. But we don't have quite that concentration that you have in Cambridge or in parts of Boston. So I think investing in east-west rail, in the Moving Forward Act, we are now on a 99% path to making sure everybody has broadband. Upgrading that system, which we're going to have to do pretty quickly as well, should be part of what we've done. But we did it in the Moving Forward Act, which I helped to write. The mayor makes these arguments that it's not legislative activity. Well, what is it? Holding a press conference that changes our lives? Going to a demonstration that changes our lives? We can shape the narrative, but it's still legislation that makes the change. I've advocated for east-west rail and feel very strongly about it. And for everybody who's watching, the chances are I'll get that done before Mayor Morse will ever get that done.
Mayor Morse, you have 90 seconds.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things that I'll observe from the onset. I mean, Congressman Neal thinks that change happens from the top down. I happen to believe that change happens from the bottom up. Organizing, listening to you, being accountable to the people of this district. And Rich, your question stated the facts quite clearly, that the economy of Massachusetts is doing quite well, except for in Western Massachusetts. And it's Congressman Neal that has been there for 30 years. And so again, how is his powerful position actually helping the people here of this district that are going hungry, that are losing their jobs, that are losing their health insurance? I mean, when I became mayor 9 years ago, we had an unemployment rate of over 13%. That dipped below 5% because we invested in innovation and entrepreneurship. Oftentimes, mayors and elected officials try to get the biggest corporation to come to town and pay employees minimum wage. And I've always focused on entrepreneurship and small business development. It creates 75% of jobs in this community and across the country. And when we think about this district, not just entrepreneurship, but agriculture, investing in regenerative agriculture in the hill towns and in the Berkshires, thinking that, again, after 30 years of a powerful position, we still have dozens of cities and towns without basic access to broadband internet. And what about the brain drain? I mean, I'm out in the Berkshires. I did a young professionals happy hour earlier this year, and young people are concerned about affordable housing, access to internet, quality jobs. I mean, we need a member of Congress that understands what real people are struggling with in every corner of this district each and every day.
Congressman Neal, you have 60 seconds.
Thank you, Rich. So the unemployment rate he now is responsible for as mayor? The success of a declining unemployment rate, by the way, I would point out, was 3% nationally. And much of the success that he's claiming credit for is based on what I did with President Obama. In the Recovery Act, we sent tens of millions of dollars for investment in western and central Massachusetts. What initiative does he have that comes close to the work that I did as mayor and as a member of Congress on Union Station? It is the hub of North-South Rail, the wise use of federal money for the purpose of restoring that track between New Haven, Hartford, and Springfield. 16 more trains a day from New Haven to Hartford and 12 from Hartford to Springfield. The mayor is now taking credit for an unemployment rate he says he changed across the country.
Mayor Morse, you have 60 seconds rebuttal.
Again, I don't think Congressman Neal understands how change happens. You know, on one hand, he wants to criticize me for lack of progress and then take credit for progress we've made in Holyoke, even though we've had little to no partnership with his office. I mean, years ago when I took office, there were plans for a north-south rail through the Pioneer Valley with no plan for a stop in Holyoke. It wasn't the federal government. It wasn't Congressman Neal. It was our administration in Holyoke, working with the people of Holyoke, with then Governor Patrick, to secure funding, MassWorks funding, to build that train platform. This is the progress we have made. And Congressman Neal keeps talking about his legislation. I mean, why is it we have the worst outcomes in the entire state and some of the worst outcomes of any congressional district in the entire country? And so he keeps talking about how proud he is of legislation. Are you proud of the businesses that are shuttering, the families in poverty, the life expectancy, the hospitals closing, people without internet, people moving out of the Berkshires and the hill towns because they can't afford the housing there? They can't even connect to the internet. We need a member of Congress that understands, again, the urgency of this moment, and Neal has shown over 30 years that he's incapable of doing so.
Gentlemen, for the next question, there is no rebuttal. You have 90 seconds to answer the question. We're getting close to the end here. Millions of Americans are struggling with college debt, and the fear of that debt prevents many other people from pursuing higher education. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden proposes forgiving federal student loan debt for undergraduates at public colleges and historically black colleges and universities. What are your thoughts on this plan, and do you think Congress can do even more to help reduce the student debt burden? Mayor Morse, you go first. You have 90 seconds.
Absolutely. I mean, education should be our country and society's greatest equalizer, and it shouldn't be reserved to those with means and wealth. I mean, I was incredibly fortunate to grow up here, the son of a father that has worked at the same meatpacking company in Springfield for the last 34 years, the son of a mom who opened up a family daycare, who had to drop out of high school when she got pregnant at 17, but they worked their entire life to move out of poverty into the working class and eventually the middle class. And I became the first in my family to go to college. And I remember those decisions we had to make. I mean, a working class family that finally bought a house shouldn't have to mortgage their entire home to send their kid to college. And this is why I support free public college for every single person in this country. We need to forgive and cancel student debt for folks in this country. Imagine a world and a country and a life. You at home, imagine a life without medical debt, without student debt. People are making decisions as to whether or not they take this job, where they move, where they live. Our generation understands this. The cost of a college education has skyrocketed over the last 30 years. And again, Congressman Neal will talk about a grant for the college, a grant here, a grant there. Well, we need to fundamentally alter our systems of government to provide opportunities to every person who wants it. I mean, we still live in a country of haves and have-nots. And I believe in a government, a federal government, a state government, and a local government that gives everybody the opportunity to go to college and get a quality education.
Congressman Neal, you have 90 seconds.
Usually he's heaping praise on me when those grants come in before he decided to run for Congress. He used to point that out, whether it was the Culinary Arts Institute at Holyoke Community College, which was transformative in the downtown area, or whether it was direct assistance to the college in the city of Holyoke. Who knows more, who has a more powerful example of their own steep climb because of education than I did? I commuted to college. I was raised by my aunt and my grandmother. We understood what Social Security meant. We understood what survivor benefits meant. $119 a month for my sisters and myself. But it gave me a chance to commute to college every day. I also sent 4 kids to college, a very different challenge. So I understand exactly the gravity of the challenges that America faces on that front, too. So I think experimenting with free community college makes a good deal of sense. I agree with Joe Biden on student loan forgiveness, but I don't think it ought to be universal. I don't think the Rockefellers should have student loan forgiveness. I think that there are those that can pay, but we should continue to assist those who don't have the ability to pay. But in my own steep climb, what was more important than access to a decent education here in Massachusetts? I paid my last $30 on my student loan, Rich, in pennies to remind myself of what it had been like in that struggle.
Thank you, Congressman Neal. Thank you, Mayor Morse. We're time now for closing statements. Each candidate will have 1 minute to make his closing statements, and the order of these closing statements was determined in a drawing before we started this debate. Congressman Neal, you'll go first.
Thanks, Rich, and thanks to Channel 22. And also a reminder tonight for those families in the Berkshires that can watch Channel 22 because in some measure of my efforts to watch this debate, I've just described what the struggle was like. I've described what upward mobility means. I described what a steep climb means because of getting a chance. That aunt and that grandmother and Roosevelt's Social Security program and their pensions made all the difference in the world for us. That's why I've defended Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and advanced the Affordable Care Act. I'm a living example of the benefits of that safety net through survivor benefits. But I want that opportunity to be extended to all members of the American family. As I heard last week or 2 weeks ago at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, a fairer, fuller, better America. Always our quest for a more perfect union. And I'm going to close on this note. Go Joe Biden and go Kamala Harris.
Mayor Morse, you have 60 seconds for a closing statement.
Great. Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Congressman. And most importantly, thank you at home for tuning into this important debate and important process. I've been asked often over the last year why I'm challenging one of the most powerful Democrats in Washington. This argument that we would somehow be losing power and influence in Congress. But the fact is we have a member of Congress that is using his power to benefit the corporate and special interests that have invested vast amounts of money in his campaign over a 30-year period. And so we will not be losing power. When I defeat Congressman Neal on September 1st, we will be gaining power because we're going to go to Washington together. I'm going to take you to Congress with me. And we're going to use our power together to fight for a health care system that believes health care is a fundamental human right. We're going to use our power together to fight climate change. We're going to use our power together to create an economy that works for everyone from Holyoke to the Hill Towns. And we're going to work together to fix our broken criminal justice system. And so I ask for your support on Tuesday, September 1st. And I encourage you to visit alexmorseforcongress.com to join this campaign in the final stretch. And thank you. It's been an honor of my life to be your candidate for Congress, and it will be an honor of my life to be your congressman. Thank you.
Gentlemen, that's all the time we have for tonight's debate. And I want to say I've done a lot of debates, but this was the most emotional and passionate and informative debate I've ever done. So congratulations on that. We'd like to thank both candidates, both Mayor Alex Morse and Congressman Richard Neal. The primary date, as we have said, is September 1st, but in-person early voting begins on Saturday, August 22nd. If you want to vote by mail, your city or town clerk must receive your request by August 26th, and those ballots must be received by September 1st. You can also, of course, vote in person on primary day. I'm Rich Teddemer. Thanks for joining us, and have a good evening.